Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2025, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, for 30 minutes.
Thank the Speaker. Today, the President of the United States issued 21 very important pardons of individuals who had been put in jail, prosecuted, persecuted for their religious beliefs and exercise of their speech. These are individuals who are pro-life, who have been put in jail because a weaponized Department of Justice was unleashed against these individuals, very specifically and purposefully because they were espousing their pro-life views. In the President's action to formally pardon these 21 individuals, he rights a wrong that was carried out against them, but more importantly, sends a loud message that the Department of Justice cannot and should not be targeted toward individuals for their political beliefs and their political actions. But that is precisely what happened to those 21 individuals. How do we know this? Well, if you look at the application of the so-called FACE Act that was used to prosecute these individuals, arrest them and prosecute them, 97% of the FACE Act prosecution between 1994 and 2024 were initiated against pro-life Americans. Now I want you to pause and listen to that again. 97% of the prosecutions under this one act were carried out against pro-life Americans. This despite the fact that there have been numerous attacks on pro-life facilities and crisis pregnancy centers in the wake of Dobbs. 91 pregnancy resource centers have been attacked since the Dobbs opinion was leaked. In 2022, pro-life activist Mark Houck was arrested by the FBI for FACE Act violations related to an incident outside of an abortion facility. They didn't charge him in Pennsylvania, and in fact, they passed. But the feds went after him. Got to ask yourself, why is that true? There have been 411 recorded attacks on Catholic churches since 2020. Was the FACE Act used once by the Department of Justice against any of these Catholic churches? No. And so what does that look like for these 21 individuals? And by the way, I think this is really important in the context of the speeches that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle were just giving with respect to the treatment of those individuals incarcerated, charged, prosecuted in the wake of January 6th. And I'll come back to that in a minute. These individuals that I'm talking about with respect to the pro-life prosecutions by the Department of Justice under Joe Biden, while Biden, this is as one of the attorneys for one of the defendants put it, while Biden's prosecutors almost entirely ignored the firebombings and vandalism of hundreds of pro-life churches and pregnancy centers, they viciously pursued pro-life Americans. And had they been opposing anything but abortion, Joe Biden would have given them medals. Instead, Biden wanted them branded as convicted felons and imprisoned for years in a federal penitentiary. Eva Idle, an 89-year-old survivor of a Soviet concentration camp who sat in front of the entrance to an abortion clinic in a wheelchair. She was one of those targeted by the Biden Department of Justice. Let's be clear that she described how she was shipped off in cattle cars to concentration camps in Yugoslavia at age 9. They were packed in body to body with no food, no water. She lived through that. She's 89 years old. Again, I want everybody to understand who's listening to this at home. An 89-year-old survivor of gulags in Europe was prosecuted by the Biden Department of Justice at age 89 for being in a wheelchair in front of an abortion clinic. Federal crime, Federal Department of Justice. Paulette Harlow, 75-year-old grandmother from Kingston, Massachusetts, has 6 children, grandmother to 8. She's suffering from health issues, liver disease, arthritis, She was prosecuted and sentenced to jail in a 25-month sentence in Texas, miles away from her home in Massachusetts, 75 years old. Why? Because she was at an abortion clinic professing her faith and her hope that they would not carry out abortions. Lauren Handy, a peaceful pro-life activist, formally sentenced to 57 months, 5-7, almost 5 years, plus 3 years supervision for her efforts to peacefully save the lives of the unborn. Now, I want to be very clear. Lauren, whom I met, is actually a progressive activist. She and I don't agree on a lot of issues. But she was out advocating for life, and she was sentenced by the Biden Department of Justice under Merrick Garland to 57 months in jail. Again, I want everybody to think about that. Protesting an abortion clinic. And nobody here, by the way, is saying that there isn't room for misdemeanor type prosecutions if you're in the way and you won't listen to the, calls for you to leave. Misdemeanor, pay a fine, whatever it might be. Federal prosecution for 57 months. John Hinshaw, 68 years old, sentenced to 21 months. He said, quote, "People are having prayer services all over the place for us. The expression of support has been tremendous." Well, today, the President of the United States righted those wrongs. And he righted those wrongs for those 4 I just described and 17 others for a total of 21. But he also sent a loud message, as I said before, that the Department of Justice never again should be politicized to target people for their beliefs, to be used as a political weapon, as it has been under the Joe Biden regime. It's a new day, and it's an important day. And in light of, I want to follow up, though, on my colleagues here who took the floor regarding January 6th. I was very clear on the floor here, on this House floor, 4 years ago during January 6th, that what occurred was wrong, that what was occurring, what had occurred was wrong, that those who had broken the law, they should be prosecuted for breaking the law. And I don't know anybody who disagrees with that. I really don't. And there are differing facts for each one of those 1,500 cases, and some of them are pretty bad facts, and some of them, there are absolutely no facts at all, but they were pursued anyway, and therein lies the problem. And I want everybody to really listen to this point. There's going to be time for us to study all 1,500 cases, and we can look and we can judge what was the nature of how they were arrested, where they were arrested, where were they put in jail, how long were they in jail, what were the conditions in the jail, how many of their loved ones could they talk to, what was their access to defense counsel, what was the nature of the prosecution, what did the judges do, what were the sentences. We need to look at all those things. Notably, the president commuted, I think, 14 individual sentences. Don't have it right in front of me, but I think it was 14. Which tells me that the president and his team went through and tried to differentiate some of the worst egregious acts in their view that shouldn't be pardoned, but rather commuted to time served. But I would also note this: we are now 48 months beyond the events. Many of these individuals were arrested early in the process, have been in jail, have been in the judicial system, and have been dragged along. I've talked to dozens of the parents, family members, wives, husbands, spouses of the people that were jailed, unable to talk to their loved ones, people without criminal records, people who had done nothing else. Many of these people were charged with just parading here in the Capitol complex, which then the court said, well, not sure about that, and then crossing a line and being a place where you're not supposed to be, the obstruction issues. Well, what were you obstructing exactly? Now, again, I think it is important to note that what occurred that day should not have occurred, that many of the acts that occurred should have been punished. Some that were punished should have been punished. But when you completely ignore the rule of law, when you politically charge people, when you use the Department of Justice as a political weapon, you undermine the rule of law and you turn it on its head so that there's no differentiation between the right and the wrong. When you literally go prosecute an 89-year-old gulag survivor because she was exercising her pro-life views at an abortion clinic, what do you think one's view is of the righteousness of the other actions of the Department of Justice? How do you look at the 1,500 and go through and break them down in a way when 48 months later, as a father was on a news show today talking about his son, saying that his son had been moved from jail to jail, had to filter the water through a sock because there was so much rust in the water, that they weren't able to talk to him for 3 weeks over Christmas, didn't even know where he was, couldn't get access to counsel during a lot of those times. What are we supposed to do with that? Ignore it? The president came in and made a judgment that these 1,500 people of varying forms, some sentenced, some not, some had taken plea deals, some not, had 48 months of their life turned upside down by a Department of Justice who wanted to try to make an example out of them, and the President of the United States said enough. And you know what? I agree. Because at the end of the day, 48 months later, many of them having been in jail for all or a lot of that time, many of them who had their doors broken down, many of them had FBI raids. I had two grandmas driving from Austin, Texas, out into the hill country just a few months ago who were arrested and jailed overnight because they were physically present here at the Capitol. Not even inside, to the best of my knowledge. I think they might have just crossed one of the bike lines. 3 years later, you arrest two grandmothers, put them in jail? Does anybody see what happens when you politicize the justice system? The scales of justice become something that you can't look at as blindfolded? And again, why am I talking about this? Because today, the president righted the wrongs of those 21 individuals who were literally protesting in their view, and I share that view, the murdering of the unborn children. I think that stuff matters. I think it matters a lot. Because had Joe Biden, had Merrick Garland not politicized the Department of Justice, then maybe 20 or 30 cases of individuals who had done something that were particularly egregious, that were prosecuted, maybe those wouldn't have been pardoned. I don't know. I haven't studied every case. But when you're looking at 1,500 cases and all the people who are being abused, I think the president did the right thing. And again, differentiated between those with the commuted sentences. But meanwhile, what the president is doing besides, I think, trying to restore balance to the justice system is he's keeping his promises to secure our country. One of my colleagues over there said the first thing the president did was make us less safe. Are you serious? Are you serious? You think reversing politicized political prosecutions 4 years later is making us less safe? May I remind my Democrat colleagues that the individual who burned down a police station, a career criminal, got 27 months. That's the idea of justice, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Let's put aside the $2 billion of damage nationwide in the wake of the Floyd riots. Let's put aside all the other damage that flowed from that. Meanwhile, what is the president doing? Making our nation much more safe. Executive order declaring a national emergency at the border. In the first Congress that I was in office, I introduced the Border Visibility and Security Act to help regain operational control of the border. I put together a bill calling on the designation of cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And I'm pleased that that was one of the president's executive orders this week, declaring cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. He issued an executive order requiring Homeland Security to deport aliens with orders of removal. There's over 1 million with orders of removal that Joe Biden wouldn't do. Again, the lawlessness of the previous administration set the stage for the dangers that we've experienced as people, and now the president, President Trump, is undoing that damage. An executive order to end categorical parole policies, undoing the CBP-1 app that was used to flood the zone with people who came into our country, were released, and did things like kill Jocelyn Nungray, whose mother, Alexis, I've gotten to know and who was with me for the inauguration this weekend. An executive order to end the catch and release program, an executive order to resume the successful migrant protection protocols and return to Mexico so we can stop the flow, to reinstate recognition of Title 42 where you're traveling through country with communicable diseases, an executive order ending birthright citizenship as it has been applied wrongly and incorrectly for years to people who have manufactured or have used a manufactured cottage industry in which people pay money to get delivered to the country, have a baby, get the citizenship, and then it is what is known as anchor babies. And it is real, and it is pervasive, and it is problematic, and it turns our country's system on its head. And by the way, yes, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to say, yeah, court today ruled that is not constitutional, so they put an injunction on it. Well, we'll see. We'll see how this plays out in the legal system. But from my reading of the law, when the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, a mere 4 years later, the United States Supreme Court in the slaughterhouse cases explicitly said, 4 years removed from the passage of an amendment to the United States Constitution, the then sitting Supreme Court said that it did not apply to people who were here as the children that were being born here of people that were foreign citizens. Another court echoed that a decade or so later. One court came in and said, well, no, we think there's birthright citizenship if you're born here to a foreign national, but only if you're a legal permanent resident. I believe the president's executive order is correct. I believe it is lawful. I believe it is constitutional. I believe he ought to continue to enforce it, and we ought to be challenging this all the way up through the courts and immediately win this. And I believe this Supreme Court will side on the right side, which is that you are a citizen if you are the child of an American citizen. Subject to the jurisdiction thereof has to matter. The president is restoring our border, restoring law and order, reversing the damage, and he should be. And he should be thanked and congratulated for it. But what else has he been doing in the last, what am I adding up, 78 hours? 78 hours in. Withdrawing us from the disastrous World Health Organization, a globalist entity that has been undermining our sovereignty and wants to take away our own decision-making and make us subject to foreign powers on our health issues. Withdrawing us from the disastrous Paris Climate Treaty, making us beholden to China and foreign nationals and unable to advance and promote our own American energy. By the way, had we not reversed all of that, we wouldn't have been adding fuel to the fire of Russia going into Ukraine, so to speak. Declaring a national energy emergency, unleashing American energy and opening up exploration, reversing Biden's ridiculous bans on offshore drilling, making it the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female, ending affirmative action and DEI in the federal government, trying to get us back to the actual view of a government that does not look through the lens of color or sex, but rather merit and hard work, requiring everybody to actually show up to work. Who knew? All of those things are things that the president is doing in a matter of 78 hours since getting sworn in a few feet from this chamber, pointing the wrong direction, a few feet from this chamber, and making our country immensely better off for it. We've already seen a massive decline in the number of people trying to come across our border. Who knew? Who could have predicted that if you enforce the law, maybe people will say, I guess we can't come now. Maybe the cartels will say, this may not be the profit center that we have at the moment. Just last night, a guy was apprehended by ICE, like somewhere up in New York or somewhere in the Northeast, and he lost his mind. He started swearing at Trump, F Trump, all this stuff. I'm with Biden forever. I'm not going back to Haiti, he said. Yeah, you are. You are. And so are a lot of other people. Because the prisons of the world shouldn't be dumped onto the streets of America, endangering our citizens. And that is what Biden did, and that is what Trump is reversing. But now we've got to deliver. And this is my message to my colleagues here. We have to deliver. My friends in the Freedom Caucus, other conservatives, we have put forward a plan that we believe would deliver, and deliver quickly. We don't have time to waste. The president needs resources. Tom Homan needs resources. The Border Patrol met with the union this last week. They need resources. ICE needs resources to do their job. So let's do it. They want $86 billion. Let's find it. We can. The defense needs to be modernized, built up after getting undermined and focused on all sorts of ridiculous woke and DEI policies. We need a new, modern, robust military to beat China. We can do that. We've put forward $200 billion over 4 years under President Trump to modernize the military, an additional $50 billion a year. Let's do it. We can do it, and we can pay for it. We said we would raise the debt ceiling, 2 years, about $4 trillion. We're not inclined to want to raise the debt ceiling, if you haven't noticed, but we'll do it. The president wants us to get that aside so Chuck Schumer can't play games with the bond market. So let's get rid of the debt, or let's increase the debt ceiling. Let's get $86 billion for border. Let's get $200 billion for defense. And then let's apply a handful of cuts to pay for those things. Let us, I don't know, how about repeal the student loan fiasco? It's $100 to $270 billion. How about let's just apply Medicaid work requirements so that if you're on Medicaid, for able-bodied Americans, not all, but the able-bodied Americans, that they must work. Pretty popular issue. Every Republican's voted for it. $120 billion. So we can pay for defense, pay for border, make our Medicaid system better, reverse the ridiculous student loan bailouts, which are giving money from one American to another. The plumber who never went to college is subsidizing the sociology major sitting in their parents' basement, tweeting about nonsense. How about we end that? You pay your student loans. You took the loans out. Plumber, you didn't. Go do your thing. Every American that I know that works hard agrees with that. We can do that. Conservatives, the Freedom Caucus, have put that forward. We want to support President Trump. We want to make sure that President Trump can deliver on the border, get the debt ceiling away from being used politically by Chuck Schumer. And so we put that plan forward. I think we should have already done it. But as usual, we sit in this body and we debate. And we continue to debate. And unfortunately, we're still debating. And unfortunately, in my opinion, we're going to continue to debate. Because there is a real debate going on about taxing and spending. And I'm blowing Republicans' minds when I say, I'm all for tax cuts, but you better cut the spending so that we can actually reduce deficits. So I've been pretty clear about that. A lot of my colleagues have been pretty clear about that. Some of my colleagues here seem to want nothing but tax cuts and no spending cuts. But I'll also hear a lot of my colleagues say, oh yeah, I'm for the spending cuts. I say, okay, well, how many? How much? Well, I mean, as many as we can get. Okay. Are we going to reduce deficits or not? I mean, that's the question I'm going to be asking everybody. Can you do math? And are we going to reduce deficits? That's the question every American sent us here to do. Do the hard work. Sit at the table. Why don't we put the microphones down, put the cameras away, use these tables, roll our sleeves up, get the paper out, and do the math. Yes, tax cuts can and do produce economic growth. More money in the hands of the people. Yes, it is morally correct to leave more money in the hands of the American people. I would gladly vote to get rid of the income tax. Zero it out. Leave the money in the hands of the people. But guess what? Whether it's President Trump's vision or views on tariffs, whether it's something else, there has to be some amount of revenue to pay for all of the promises and all of the programs that every politician loves to go home and run on. So now the rubber meets the road, or the piper needs to be paid, or whatever metaphor you want to use. We cannot have our cake and eat it too. You can't run around and beat up the CBO and blame the CBO and say, they never score anything right. Well, you know what? You're probably correct. They're human beings. And maybe they're biased. Fine. Okay. You think they're biased? Great. Come in with your models. Come in with somebody else's models and show me how the math is going to work out that if we do all of these tax cuts and do no spending cuts, that somehow we're magically going to have deficits going down. Because it's just not going to be true in the aggregate. When Ronald Reagan cut taxes in 1981 from the confiscatory top rate of 70% under Jimmy Carter to 28% on the top marginal rate, yeah, there was a lot of good economic growth. When we cut corporate rates 8 years ago from 35% to 21%, and corporations aren't these blobs, they're people. When we cut the corporate rates, yeah, there was pretty significant economic growth. That was pretty meaningful. Trying to keep more capital here. Expensing, research and development, all these things create growth. But a lot of tax cuts don't. Take the child tax credits. I get how child tax credits can be argued to be good policy, pro-family policy, good for hardworking families that have kids. There are a lot of arguments for child tax credits. But they're not going to be massively stimulative. They cost about $800 billion over 10 years. So my point is over here is like, what are you cutting? What are we cutting? Because we can't continue to rack up deficits. And I think I'm running close on time, and I just want to close with this. We right now have 36 point whatever trillion dollars in debt. Right now, we are racking up about $1.8 to $2 trillion a year in deficits. When the interest on the bonds that we currently hold are getting refinanced over the next couple of years, those interest payments are going to go up, probably to the tune of another $200 to $300 billion a year. If we renew all of the tax cuts, which I support, but we don't offer any cuts correspondingly, we will add hundreds of billions, if not several trillion dollars of deficit spending. So the job for us, Republicans and Democrats, is to not do that. And I'm asking for deficit neutrality on the tax bill. Let me just be clear. If I win that fight, if all my colleagues who want deficit neutrality or deficit reduction on the tax bill combined with spending cuts being debated in reconciliation right now, if I win that fight that I'm having right now with colleagues, you're like, oh, I don't know. The best we'll get is the current deficit. That's how we would end up with exactly what we have right now of roughly $2 trillion deficits. By the way, it'll get worse because of the interest I told you about as we keep refinancing our debt and interest goes up. So what I'm trying to scrap for in this body is just trying not to make it worse. It's like Christmas Vacation. You know? Worse? How can it get any worse? I'll tell you how it can get worse. Vote for more deficits. So we shouldn't do that. And my actual last point, with I think a minute and a half remaining, is that if we're going to do anything at all in reconciliation on policy, we should be fighting for healthcare freedom. My office put out a report 2 days ago called The Case for Healthcare Freedom. It's 48 pages that outlines all of the ways in which we are destroying the average American's access to healthcare, that we need to restore the doctor-patient relationship, that we need to break down the stranglehold that insurance companies and hospitals and pharma have on our healthcare, free them up with expansive health savings accounts, allow them to decouple that so they can go out in the market and get actual insurance, go to direct primary care, and actually get care for themselves instead of paying $25,000 a year between their employer and themselves to be able to go to an insurance company and be told that they can't get care. So if we want to transform this country, reduce the deficits, give the president what he needs to secure the border, and give us health care freedom. And that's my call to my colleagues. And with that, I yield back.